Well, today I'll be talking about 10 underrated fifth albums from my collection. And with these albums, we got some rock in here while also having some metal in here too. But this will be in no particular order, but the first album I do want to talk about is from one of my personal favorite bands, Aerosmith, with their fifth album, Draw the Line. So this album follows up their album Rocks, which is my favorite Aerosmith album, and for many people this album is a step down from the albums that came before it, especially Rocks, and I get it, but I still think this is another pretty solid album from Aerosmith. With this album, it's a bit more raw, but still rockin', of course. I mean, some of my favorites on here, of course, the title track, which is, to me, one of the band's best title tracks. You also have Get It Up, which I think is one of the stronger deep cuts off this album, and also one of my favorites on the album. Critical Mass, I think, is also kind of underrated. You also have Bright Light Fright, which is a fairly short, catchy song with Joe Perry on vocals. You also have one of the fan favorites on here, Kings and Queens, another pretty good song off the album, another highlight. Sight for Sore Eyes is another pretty good deep cut off the album, but yeah. Maybe not top shelf Aerosmith, but still, I'd say another pretty good album from them. But next we're moving to The Cult with their album Ceremony. So this album is following their album Sonic Temple, which was a huge commercial success for them with hits like Firewoman and Edie. But yeah, this album came out in 91 and commercially didn't do as well as Sonic Temple, unfortunately, but I still think it's still a pretty good album. And this album actually came out in the same year as big albums like Nevermind and the Black Album from Metallica, of course. So this album didn't really stand much of a chance because there were a lot of huge commercially successful albums from that year. Again, albums like Nevermind, the Black Album, 10, and many other albums. But still, at the end of the day, I still think this is another pretty good album from The Cult. Maybe not their best, but one of their best, I'd say maybe. I mean, you do get some of my favorite Cult songs on here, like the title track, which I think is one of the band's best album openers. Wild Hearted Son, I think that's maybe one of the band's best singles. I also really like Heart of Soul, one of the more melodic songs in here, but I still really dig that song. But I think this album also has some pretty underrated deep cuts, or underrated songs in general, like White, which I think is one of the band's best deep cuts in general, if I'm being honest. Full Tilt's another solid rocker for the band. You move towards the second half, I like Bangkok Rain and Sweet Salvation, but yeah. All around, another pretty good album from The Cult. But yeah, that would be their first album into the 90s, but let's go ahead and move on to something a bit heavier, moving into the world of melodic death metal, one of the leading names in the genre. Dark Tranquillity with Haven, their first album into the 2000s, and with this album, you do notice the presence of keyboards / electronics. You can definitely hear that in songs such as The Wonders, At Your Feet, and The Same. Those two songs being some of my favorites on the album. But you also have the song Fabric, which is another one of my favorites, and also maybe one of my favorite deep cuts from the band in general. I really like that song a lot. Definitely overlooked. Not Built to Last seems to be another fan favorite off the album. That's another really good song off the album to me. I think the title track is another song that I think is one of the best songs on the album too. But yeah, while with Projector, you definitely saw the inclusion of more clean vocals. This album, you definitely get more harsher vocals, but you do get a little bit of clean vocals here and there, such as in a song like Empty or Still, if I'm thinking of the right song. But Haven, pretty good album, I'd say, and maybe one of my favorite Dark Tranquillity albums, if I'm being honest. But yeah, this album doesn't really get the same love as albums like The Gathering or Damage Done or even Fiction, but even with all that, still, again, another great album from Dark Tranquillity, and overall, a pretty solid discography, I'd say. But next we're moving to Def Leppard with their album Adrenalize, which is following up, of course, probably one of the biggest rock albums of the 80s, Hysteria. And yeah, this album had the tough task of having to do that, of following that album up. And I think they did a pretty good job. I mean, I think this album is one of the band's best, probably my fourth favorite. But yeah, this is their first album without Steve Clark. I almost said rest in peace, Megadeth reference, rest in peace. But yeah, with this album, I mean, you have the song Let's Get Rocked, which is the big song off of here, but I feel like the rest of the album is somewhat kind of underrated. I do think you get one of the band's best ballads on this album, that song being Stand Up, Kick Love into Motion. I really like that song a lot, and a single from them that I feel should have been bigger. Another single off this album that I think should have been bigger is Make Love Like a Man. Fairly catchy anthemic song for them. I also like Tonight. That song's a bit more darker, more melodic, and overall I kind of dig it. Another more slept on song off the album, I'd say. And if you're looking for more Def Leppard anthems, I Want to Touch You, I think is another pretty good one off this album. But yeah, all around, another really great album from Def Leppard. And next we're moving to something a bit heavier, moving into the 2000s. We got Archetype from Fear Factory. So this album follows up the trilogy that they did. That trilogy, of course, being Demanufacture, Obsolete, and Digimortal. And this would also be the first album without Dino Cazares, who would, of course, return later on with the album Mechanized in 2010. But yeah, with this album definitely brings the heavy. It's also a bit more raw, too. But yeah, I personally really dig this album. Maybe not their number one best, but still, I'd say another really good album from Fear Factory. If I were to be a little bit more nitpicky, maybe I don't know if you can maybe consider this a nitpick, but I do think the first half is easily the stronger half. But the second half does have some solid tracks though, like Bone Scraper and Human Shields. But with the first half, banger after banger, so many killer songs. Slave Labor is definitely one of my personal favorites off the album. Of course, the biggest song on here is probably the title track, which is definitely another strong song off the album and also one of the best songs on here. But I think this album has maybe some of the band's best deep cuts, arguably, such as songs like Act of God and Corporate Cloning. Corporate Cloning, which to me might have some of Burton's best vocal performances on the album. And then you also have Bite the Hand That Bleeds, which, if I remember correctly, was on one of the Saw soundtracks. I can't remember which one. It might have been the first or the second one, but either way, that's another pretty good song off the album. I do like Burton's vocals in that song too. But yeah, Archetype, pretty good Fear Factory album. Definitely underrated. The next we're moving towards the world of gothic metal. And yeah, Lacuna Coil with Shallow Life. So this would be their first album with Don Gilmore in the producer chair. And when this album first came out, it got fairly mixed reviews. And you can make the argument that this is maybe the band that they're most radio friendly. I mean, you can maybe say it's not as heavy as other albums like Karma Code or Black Anima or some others, but even with all that, I still think this is another solid album from Lacuna Coil. Definitely not their best, but also not their worst either. But I think you do get some pretty good songs on here, like Spellbound, which I think is one of the band's best singles. Survive, I think, is a solid way to open up the album. You do get some solid vocal chemistry between Andrea and Christina. I think they have great vocal chemistry on this album. You can definitely notice that in songs like Spellbound and I Won't Tell You. But you also get some solid deep cuts off the album too. Some of my favorite deep cuts on here being The Maze and I'm Not Afraid. But yeah, all around, another good album from Lacuna Coil. Maybe not top shelf Lacuna Coil, but still another pretty good album for them. Next, we're moving to POD, one of the early bands in the world of nu metal, with their self-titled album, POD, Payable on Death. This would be one of the albums without Marcos on guitar. Instead, we have Jason Truby on guitar, and this is one of the two albums that they did with Jason. And something you notice with this album is that it's a bit more darker, and you get less rap vocals on this album compared to some other albums like Elements of Southtown or Satellite, for example. But yeah, commercially didn't really do as well as Satellite, but I still think this is actually probably one of my personal favorites from the band. Nowadays, Southtown, Fundamental Elements of Southtown is probably my favorite POD album. If it's not that one, then it would be Satellite, of course, but I still think this album is actually maybe one of their best. Doesn't really sound like really any of their other albums in their discography, but some of my favorites on here, Change the World, which is maybe one of my favorite singles from the band, Will You, I think, is another strong single from the band. I also like Wildfire, pretty good way to open up the album. You also get some really good deep cuts or lesser known songs on here, like Freedom Fighters, which to me has some of Sonny's best vocals on the album. I also like I and Identify. I think that's another kind of overlooked deep cut off the album. And then the album closes with Eternal, which is a pretty unique instrumental. I do like that one too. Maybe a song that I might not return to as much as some of the other songs in here, but I still think is a pretty cool instrumental though. Execute the Sounds seems to be one of the fan favorites off of here, and for good reason. That's another one of my favorites on the album. But yeah, all around, I really dig this album. And next we're moving to one of the leading bands in the world of prog metal and one of the early bands in the genre, Queensryche, with their fifth album, Promised Land. Now, you definitely get differing opinions, a variety of opinions on this album. For some people, this is the beginning of their decline, and for some, while others view this as their last really good album. And for me, I think this was their last pretty good album. I mean, the album they did after this, Here and the Now Frontier, I think is all right. But if we're talking actually great or amazing or anything like that, I think this is definitely the last one. Of course, until Todd joined the band with the self-titled album. I think the album that they've done so far with Todd have all been pretty good. The Verdict probably being my favorite. But anyways, back to this album, Promised Land. With this album, the band goes a bit more darker, a bit more moody, a bit more atmospheric, and personally, I really dig it, and it's maybe one of my favorite albums of 1994. But some of my favorites on here, I Am I really like that one. That's one of the singles off the album. I also like Bridge, which, if I remember correctly, is another single off the album. You also have the epic title track, which is dark, a bit more moody, and I really like that one, especially Jeff's vocals in that song especially. You also have Disconnected, which is a bit of a weirder song, but that's actually another one of my favorites on the album. If I had to pick one song that sounds the closest to something off of the album before it, Empire, it'd probably be the song My Global Mind. That's another good song off the album. I don't know if it's one of my personal favorites on the album, but still a solid track though. But all around, another really good album from Queensryche. And now we're moving to one of my personal favorites in the world of nu metal, Sevendust, with their fifth album, Next. So this would be one of the albums without Clint. This time we got Sonny Mayo, and this would be the first album they would do with Sonny. And honestly, this album and Alpha kind of fight for being my favorite of the Sonny era. I mean, I might lean more towards Alpha, but at the same time, this album's not too far behind that album, though. I mean, with this album, you do have your heavier moments, of course, such as in songs like Hero and Silence and Pieces. But you also have your more melodic moments like This Life and Shadows in Red. Of course, since that it is Sevendust, you do get some great vocal work in this album, such as in songs like Ugly and This Life from Lejeune. Definitely one of the best vocalists in the world of nu metal. Definitely one of the most unique too. And once you hear his voice, you instantly know that it's him. But yeah, some of my favorites on here: Hero, Ugly, Pieces. Failure is another one of my favorites. I think that song is definitely a tad underrated. But all around, another good album from Sevendust. Maybe not top shelf Sevendust, but still pretty good, I'd say. I might be more towards the middle pack for me personally, maybe, but. Anyways, let's go ahead and move on to the final album for this video. Stone Temple Pilots for Shangri-La-Di-Da. To me, their last good album. I'm not a big fan of either self-titled album, the one with Scott and the one with the guy they have now, Jeff. I'm not a fan of either of those self-titled albums, but yeah, again, for me, the last good Stone Temple Pilots album. But the biggest song on here, if I had to guess, is probably Days of the Week, which I know not every fan is into, but I like that song. But you have some other really good songs on here, like Coma and Dumb Love, which those songs definitely deliver the heavy. I really like those ones. Even the more melodic songs, I think, are also pretty good, like Hello It's Late and Too Cold Queenie. Of course, you get some pretty good vocals from Scott Weiland in this album, rest in peace, such as in songs like Too Cold Queenie and Black Again. But to me, another pretty good album from Stone Temple Pilots. But yeah, those are 10 underrated fifth albums from my collection. Let me know your thoughts on these albums here and all that good stuff. But anyways, thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, a like, subscribe. Have a nice day, and take care.